You okay? Uh-oh. Okay.
Wait a second.
Good morning. Let's go ahead and get started.
Good morning, Commissioners. District 1, Commissioner Shernock. District 2, Commissioner Hampton.
Present.
District 3, Commissioner Herbert.
Present.
District 4, Commissioner Forsyth.
Present.
District 5, Chair Shadid.
Present.
District 6, Commissioner Carpenter.
Present.
District 7, Commissioner Wheeler Reagan. District 8, Commissioner Blair.
I'm here.
District 9, Commissioner Sleeper. District 10, Commissioner Housewright.
Here.
District 11, vacant. District 12, Commissioner Hawk. District 13, Commissioner Hall.
Here.
District 14, Commissioner Kingston. Here. And place 15, Vice Chair Rubin.
Here.
You have a quorum, sir.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Commissioners. Today is Thursday, November 21st, 2024 at 9:08 a.m. Welcome to the briefing of the Dallas City Plan Commission. Good morning, Commissioners. We have a long agenda, lots of items. I think we can get through it. We will get through it. We must get through it. We're going to start off with the parking. Good morning.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Commissioners. Let's see. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Okay. I'm Michael Wade, Interim Chief Planner of Code Amendments for the Planning and Development Department. I know you have a very full day today, so my PowerPoint was pretty long that I sent out. I'm going to hit the high points of each one, and I think as questions arise, maybe we can dig into some more details. We're talking about off-street parking and loading code amendment that has been going on for a few years now. Today is just the briefing. Of course, it's not a public hearing on the topic, but we do want to just give you the information needed for when you do come back and discuss it at the public hearing. We'll talk a little bit about the background, why this is a topic worth considering, then we'll jump right into the proposal. We'll talk about the TDMP, we'll talk about parking minimums and some design considerations, and then we'll go right into some concerns that have come up. There are 4 points where staff has come up with some recommended revisions. These are generally just in line with ZOAC's conversation. These are really just tweaks to make this as good of a tool, as good of a code amendment as we can. So let's jump in. This began, really it was formally authorized in 2019. There were conversations on the topic before that, a whole lot of ZOAC meetings for the 2 years following, meetings, listening sessions, all of those ZOAC meetings were functionally public hearings too. There was a break for a couple of years during leadership changes, department changeover. We came back in 2023, that's a typo, August 4th and 8th, 2023. We held listening sessions, additional ZOAC meetings, and finally the ZOAC vote on the code amendment happened on January 30th, 2024. This is just sort of listing the topics at each meeting in the listening sessions. Currently, I know that this body is very aware, so I won't linger on current regulations. We have parking minimums per land use. There are some variances, there are some exceptions, but very limited, and then planned development districts kind of carry their own customized public parking minimums. We have several design considerations in our regulations. The way this interacts with review, as a site plan comes in, zoning reviewers check it out. For larger and complex development projects, they go to transportation reviewers. We're studying this because over time, these regulations, these parking regulations, have been found to really get in the way of some city goals, slow and prevent new housing production, constrain adaptable reuse and redevelopment of existing buildings, impose a really cumbersome process for staff and anyone trying to go through permitting, getting the project permitted. It disproportionately burdens small businesses, and this has an equity impact, perpetuates really an unsafe, unwalkable, totally unpleasant environment very often. It works against adopted environmental sustainability goals, preserves a financially underperforming land use, and overall is just a very generic, relatively baseless solution that has very little to do with the context of any given land use. This is an ecosystem too, so not going through everything, but we know that building parking causes more driving. So this is not just about land use, this is also about transportation behavior. This is about how it impacts the environment. This is a climate and health issue. This is a water quality issue, a heat island effect issue, a biodiversity issue. This is a financial issue. Again, long tentacles into the ecosystem of someone's financial life in Dallas. Parking spaces are extremely expensive to build. They can be. This adds up to increases in rent, monthly rent, increases in home purchase prices, and then grocery, household items, everything else. A developer has to roll in their cost for their parking spaces into the products that they're selling. It's very costly, the delays that this causes as someone goes through permitting. And then it's costly from a land use perspective. We have a finite amount of land in the city. Is parking really the best use of that land when there could be a more productive tax use that contributes to sidewalks, street repair, et cetera? And then just walkability, urban fabric, the feel. We don't use the word feel in zoning code, but we all know that this is a mental and health reality in our world. Is this the highest and best land use? Our plans, these are kind of our North Star for making a lot of these decisions. These are adopted plans. These are the directions that the city has decided to go. Environmental justice and stewardship, multimodal transportation systems, housing affordability and options, equitable economic opportunity, and walkable communities. Forward Dallas 2.0 was just adopted. That leads us to parking minimums in certain contexts. Investigate reduction and removal of restrictive parking requirements impacting small businesses or development feasibility. Update development code to reduce or eliminate parking minimums in TOD areas. Consider implementation of parking maximums in these areas. Very importantly also, our comprehensive environmental and climate action plan, and then Connect Dallas and many of our other plans discuss how land use impacts transportation. We want to avoid increases in single occupancy, gasoline-powered vehicle trips. We're trying to increase the mode share of alternative forms of transportation, and then just increase access, what's conveniently around us. Lastly, in these plans, also recently this year, our on-street parking and curb management policy was adopted at City Council that sets the direction for managing curb parking in overspill situations with tools like parking benefit districts, local parking and curb management plans, and time-limited and paid parking areas, and then describes the existing and updates to the residential parking only permits. So let's jump right into the proposal. Again, it's three parts: transportation demand management plan, parking minimums, and parking design. The transportation demand management plan, or TDMP, from here out is just assembling our current development review practices into a formal and predictable review program that requires developments to plan comprehensively for their impact on transportation systems. Parking minimums, this proposal is to remove parking minimums citywide to allow right-sized parking site by site, and then parking design that leans into walkability, provides for walkability especially. Let's talk about the transportation demand management plan. This is something that does happen in cities and counties around the country, also in Europe, Germany, England, et cetera. We're just assembling current staff considerations for transportation review into a transparent, predictable review causing development and redevelopment projects to incentivize the use of sustainable transportation types in pursuit of adopted city transportation and environmental stewardship goals. This is generally in two parts. What's being introduced into the code as a new 51A-4.804, that's the bulk of it. That is the process, that is triggering thresholds, that is review type, that's the narrative of the development from beginning to end, and then a TDMP guide that would be adopted by City Council. This is just the technical guide, and we'll get into what's in that. The requirements of this program. What we're proposing for this 4.804, a chart of project thresholds would be in the code, and we'll look at that chart in a minute. Thresholds are based on ranges of new dwelling units, new commercial square footage, and in particular non-residential land uses regardless of scale. When a development or redevelopment project reaches one of those thresholds, it will undergo a minor or major review at the time of site plan review. It's really just part and parcel with the site plan review. Additional submission requirements really just codify what staff ask for anyway. We want you to look at traffic, we want you to look at transit, we want you to look at pedestrian infrastructure, etc. The project is also assigned a point target. Now, when we say assigned, again, the chart will have point targets, and so we'll see the chart. This will be adopted by City Council. It will be predictable. There will be nothing surprising about it. At the very first conception of a development project, someone will be able to go online and see, okay, this is in this location, this is of this number of dwelling units, this number of square footage, so I'll need to hit this number of points, completely transparent and predictable. The point target must be reached by implementation of strategies that encourage reductions in single occupant gasoline-powered vehicle trips. These strategies will be in the TDMP guide, adopted, transparent, predictable, in sort of a menu format, and will include the possibility of customizing strategies. So if you're if you, being the developer, if you are in a particular location with a particular kind of land use that maybe doesn't work well in some of the strategies that are in the guide, bring our staff your own ideas. Totally open for that. Strategies are assigned points, so add a bike rack, get 5 points, that kind of thing, and the developer adds these strategies until they reach the point target. The TDMP, the plan must be approved in order to get your building permit, and then we'll check to make sure that you've implemented these strategies in order to be issued a certificate of occupancy. Currently, there are 3 review types. Minor, just submit the documents, implement strategies to reach your point target, boom, you're good to go. The major, submit the documents, implement the strategies, and then you may need to submit a transportation impact analysis or other transportation study materials. Now, this is a place of the first staff recommended revision. In ZOAC's recommendation, there was also a discretionary review. This is for developments in strange places or with abnormal collections of land uses, just things where we can't really foresee exactly what the transportation impact is going to be. This discretionary review is just a very explicit place for our staff to say, we need you to submit these additional documents to tell us how you're going to manage this impact. One thing that we've heard from the development community pretty clearly is that they want to limit unpredictability, and that makes sense. That helps them to move faster and deliver the homes and businesses that the city needs. So this discretionary review side gave some people some heartburn. It's something that after talking with staff on the implementation side of this, we don't think we really need. And so this is one place that we can consider a revision. So this is the chart. It's small, maybe on your PowerPoint, if you printed it out or on your computer, you had a chance to look through this. The left side, outlined in yellow, is what's proposed to be adopted in code. This is the thresholds, the number of dwelling units, the number of square footage, particular land uses, and the review types. This plus the blue section would be in the TDMP guide. The blue section are the particular numbers. We're at probably 75% draft on these numbers. We're working with the GDPC, the Greater Dallas Planning Council, on reviewing this and kind of reviewing the guide exactly. And so these numbers aren't final, but they demonstrate the ballpark. So for instance, if you are building a new building with 20 units, you are not near a rail station, you're not in downtown, you might have a point target of about 5. We've created this to be a very light touch program, much less complicated or burdensome than in other cities. And so you can do something like add an additional bike rack, maybe a bike repair facility, something relatively easy. You've got your 5 points, you're good to go. Just an example of the menu of strategies. Now this is intended to be eventually all online, one very easy to use platform, all the mapping resources that you need, very easy to use, modeled after Denver's. Denver's is extremely easy to use. But so we have categories, we've got subcategories, but the most important thing are the strategies. So subsidizing transit passes is what we're looking at here. You see, okay, we're in a place where our point target needs 10 points. Call up DART, call up Daniel Dickerson there, using the a residential pass program that they're basically just sitting ready to push a button and set up. They've done it in other places too. Get that set up with DART. DART calls us, the developer calls us, they've done it, stamp, you're good to go, you've got your 10 points that meets your target, something like that. And so we've worked with DART on setting this up, for example, whether it's programmatic or whether it's physical. Show us that it's implemented, you're good to go. Categories include transit, shared mobility, electric vehicle infrastructure, loading management, pedestrian realm, active transportation, parking pricing, and then a more recent addition is just locational efficiency. Are you a mixed-use development? What kind of uses are there that really make sense when put together? What kind of land uses are you close to? This was another comment from GDPC and from the development community. Example strategies, again, bicycle infrastructure, pedestrian infrastructure, making a special design for pickup and drop-off activities so that you don't just have trucks idling outside of your development. On the programmatic side, again, DART subsidy, providing shuttle services, joining or forming something like a transportation management authority or another group that can manage parking and transportation for a group of properties. There's the chance for an exemption to this. If you're in a place where actually the number of dwelling units and the number of square footage don't directly translate to your traffic impact. Maybe it's a particular land use, a particular location. You can apply for a waiver to this program, so there's flexibility. Also, I didn't create a slide for this, but going back here, again, you can customize your particular assemblage or just come up with a new strategy that makes sense and incentivizes people to drive alone a little bit less and think about what other options are out there if they want to. Compliance and enforcement. A mobility coordinator must be designated and kept up with at the city as a point of contact. This is just a point of accountability, someone to talk to make sure that these strategies are being implemented. Self-audits for 2 years from the point of issuance of the certificate of occupancy. This can be as easy as a city-provided survey. Here are some questions to ask, email to your residents, send it back, you're done. Other cities, Austin, San Francisco, others require extremely lengthy and technical monitoring documentation. That's not the direction that we're going right now. Staff can check the property at any time for implementation with appropriate, respectful notice of the property. If found to be delinquent, mainly we're just encouraging you, come work with us to achieve what your plan was, or we can amend the plan. We can change the plan if need be, but in general, work with us to achieve the goals of the TDMP. Here's another point of a staff recommended revision, simply adding one line to the compliance section of this code, clarifying that a property needs to work with staff in the case of a lot of parking spillover that is producing true nuisances in the neighborhood around the development. Parking minimums, this will be much easier to explain, even if it's a hot topic as well. Parking minimums. required off-street parking for each land use in 4.200 just becomes 0. We're not really changing the structure on that point. We're just reducing it to 0 so that sort of basically all of the PDs that still interrelate with 51A and 51, none of those legal connections are broken. We'll talk a little bit more about parking minimums. Just want to touch on loading minimums. In the ZOAC's recommendation, it came with the line. Well, so currently, multifamily buildings have no minimums, no minimum loading. This makes it tough when a 200-unit apartment building comes in. Our transportation reviewers have to say, we know that people will be moving in and moving out. What are you doing for loading? And they get blank stares. The ZOAC's recommendation was to add the line, adequate off-street space for loading must be provided at the director's discretion. See section 4.303 for loading regulations. After hearing again from the development community, there's a desire to limit unpredictability, talking this over with review staff. We recommend going in the direction of just show us on the plans how you're going to manage the loading that happens. So it's not about the number of your loading spaces necessarily, but just when you turn in your site plan, show us. On-site or off-site areas of anticipated loading and unloading activity, including short-term pickup and drop-off, must be identified at the time of building permit, including any relevant building components such as freight, elevator, and entrances, just to begin the conversation and make sure that management of loading is a topic that the developer is thinking about. Planned development districts, we have a lot of them. Y'all deal with them all the time. You know that some of them have 100% their own parking requirements. They don't relate to 51A or 51. So changes that we make to 51A or 51 don't necessarily, as far as the minimums, don't necessarily impact these minimums. There are others that are completely reliant on 51A and 51. Those would be impacted by a change to 0 minimums in 51A and 51. And then, of course, many of them are just customized. It will be a PD that was set up for a hospital. The only parking minimum in that PD is for hospitals. And so that parking minimum that's customized and specified there would remain. Some lessons from other cities. Buffalo, just starting off with a very interesting one. Buffalo removed parking minimums citywide. They saw, on average, a 21% fewer new parking spaces across the city. The study of this broke that down into mixed-use, dedicated residential, and dedicated commercial. The true reduction was in mixed use. Residential and commercial dedicated properties were still building more parking than the previous minimum. So those by themselves, if you take mixed use out of the calculation, all of these properties were still building a lot more parking than they were required to in the first place. Where it was really effective was mixed use properties. And on average, 21% fewer new parking spaces were being built. Austin has eliminated parking minimums. That was recent enough that we don't have data from that. Yes, this takes time to roll out, but they have a program called Affordability Unlocked that's similar to our MIHDB program, where the inclusion of affordable units allows flexibility in parking. They saw 25% fewer new parking spaces under that program. Going clockwise down to Seattle, Seattle parking reforms resulted in 40% less new parking. That's sort of getting up there into the eyebrow-raising zone until you read the King County report that came out before that. King County, where Seattle is located, took a survey of all parking spaces across the city, and they saw that 40% of parking spaces, across the county, 40% of all parking spaces across the county are never used. And so with this parking reform in Seattle, we see that the new sites were just right-sized in the amount of parking that they were developing. And then lastly, Minneapolis, they've been working on this incrementally since 2012. In 2012, the average new parking ratio for multifamily units was 1.2 spaces per unit. By 2023, they had eliminated minimums. It was at 0.7 per unit. The study that produced these numbers didn't break down whether these are mixed use or just residential. Staff anecdotally have observed a lot of mixed-use buildings going up there and wonder if this is similar to Buffalo, where dedicated multifamily properties are still building a lot, but it's mixed-use properties where you don't need to drive as much, where this really can produce an impact. Staying on Minneapolis for a minute, they've seen that this impacts housing prices. While the rest of Minnesota saw increases in housing prices, Minneapolis stayed flat in housing prices. This came at the time of a couple of other zoning changes too, but their planning director has said a couple of times now, no single legislative action did more to contribute to housing creation than the elimination of parking minimums. This is something that's happening around the country and around the world. I'm not showing the countries in Europe on this map, but there are several. The red dots on this map have eliminated minimums completely. The orange dots were just significant reductions. The latest was Newport News in Virginia, the largest in North America, Mexico City, Toronto, Edmonton, and Austin. And just repeating the note that in Dallas, we've been doing this incrementally through PDs, through the MIHDB program, and in downtown. Parking design, just a handful of parking requirements. Near the beginning of this study, we had included a whole lot of environmental standards in this as well. Those have overall been sliced off and reallocated to our impervious coverage code amendment, which has also been voted on by ZOAC and is coming to CPC really right after parking. And any of the things that I'm about to say are subject to waivers and exemptions if they don't work for a particular property. Curb cuts, the location and number of curb cuts can really impact the walkability around a property. So we're proposing curb cut limitations on just lots with 1 to 4 unit dwellings. One curb cut maximum of 12 feet or 20 feet if it's a shared curb cut with a neighboring property. This is measured at the sidewalk, so this is not a limitation on the driveway width. Again, that's something else that will be sort of approximated in the impervious coverage code amendment, but this is just on the entrance, on the driveway entrance. Curb cuts off of alleyways. Currently, for multifamily properties, if you are adjacent to an alleyway that is adjacent to single-family duplex or townhome zoning, you can't locate the entrance to your parking lot off of that alleyway. That causes a lot more curb cuts, a lot more conflict points at the sidewalk of streets around that property. And so we are proposing to do away with that limitation, and then also just to do away with the limitation on enclosed parking spaces that they need to be 20 feet from alleyways. We have electric garage openers now. Pedestrian paths. This proposed requirement would require pedestrian paths through parking lots within 65 feet of any space. So you've probably seen this in some larger parking lots where there's one path going from the door to the sidewalk. That just gets the pedestrian to the pedestrian network. The goal of this in general is to give people safe access from their car to the front door. This can count sidewalks if it's within that 65 feet distance from spaces. And one main path must connect to the existing pedestrian network and must be raised to the level of the curb or sidewalk and be of contrasting color or texture when crossing a drive aisle. Some quick images, again, these are not uncommon. The parking setback. Parking for any use will need to be located behind one front setback line. So there are situations of corner lots, through lots, etc. This is only relevant for one of those setback lines, one of those front setback lines. Drainage, introducing a prohibition on draining surface water from parking lots across the surface of sidewalks. You can go under, you can go around. There are a lot of techniques for this. The one item that was proposed by staff that was not recommended by ZOAC was a requirement on the location of parking. The requirement was that parking must be located to the rear or to the side of a building. This was not recommended by ZOAC, so it's not currently a part of the proposal. There has been an idea for a revision to make it an incentive. If you locate all of your parking behind the building, your front porch, front stoop, et cetera, can locate in the front setback. Bicycle parking, just updating design considerations, prohibiting a couple of styles of racks that our active transportation planners say are not anywhere near best practices, and changing the minimum requirement from 1 bike space per 25 required vehicle spaces to 1 bike space per 20 provided vehicle spaces with a minimum of 2. All right, we'll just talk about some concerns and some questions that we've heard, some general responses, and I'll hand it back over to you. So some questions that we've heard. I need to drive to carry my kids around for work or because I have mobility impairments that prevent me from any other use of transportation. How am I supported? Just to be clear on this, ADA handicap regulations are still in effect. Those are federal regulations. They're a ratio of accessible parking spaces to all other parking spaces. The very first parking space needs to be a van accessible space, and there's a whole body of design regulations around that and around access to the front door. Those will stay. Additionally, the city allows vehicles with a handicap decal or license plate to park in metered street parking for free. That's something I didn't know until performing this study, one of the best kept secrets of Dallas. You can park in a street metered space. Your usual destinations will still provide parking. Developers are still under a great amount of pressure to build all the parking. We saw, again, bringing up Buffalo, anywhere else, a lot of the other developers that you talk to, generally they're going to be building loads of parking. This is about flexibility. This is about getting the city out of the game of requiring additional parking that don't make sense in a given situation. The resulting change from this amendment will be very slow. This is a generational change that we're talking about, not just because of the slow pace of development, but because of how just kind of little bit by little bit this change will impact the city over time. I live in a low-density neighborhood next to multifamily buildings that already produce parking along the public curb in front of my home. Won't this just increase? Many multifamily buildings do produce spillover parking. As we've gone through and checked particular ones that have been brought to us, time and again it's management. Time and again they're charging a certain fee, and residents choose to opt out of it. This isn't a quantity of spaces issue. And then parking spaces are valuable to properties. So I know that I live in and near multifamily spaces. Every single one of those parking spaces is an amenity that they want to keep, and if they're not keeping it, if they're replacing it with something else, it needs to make sense in their pro forma. It's going to be expensive to lose, expensive to replace, and very generally, this is not going to work in pro forma without a major redevelopment. I live on a low-density block right next to a popular commercial corridor where parking minimums limit growth, maintain the existing built form, and keep out undesirable land uses. We love these areas sometimes, and we want more of them very often. These should not be unique. We have a situation where people from around the city, people from around the county, come specifically to a couple of areas that were developed before parking minimums. And then we drive there, and then we wonder why we can't find parking there. These are places that, with guided zoning changes, I can have my neighborhood restaurant, I can have my walkable area, and I won't need to go to the same place that everyone else is going. Increases in the value of these areas are changing, and it changes the nature of which businesses can locate in high-value areas. The appropriateness of land uses, additionally, should be targeted with land use regulations, not parking requirements, and then for targeted, localized transportation issues, traffic impacts, we have the on-street parking and curb management policy, and then additionally, in the end, PDs, which are still an option to enact parking minimums. Excuse me. What about incremental changes? We touched on PDs, downtown, and MIHDB projects as ones that have sort of been ongoing test subjects for this idea. Partial reductions to minimums really don't achieve the permitting efficiency possible with full elimination. That's a just categorical difference. Geographically isolated reductions don't address vehicle miles and the transportation system in its full breadth as a regional situation. We're driving across Dallas, we're driving to Fort Worth, we're driving to Denton and Arlington, et cetera. And then full removal itself, again, is expected to just produce very slow change, incremental progress toward city adopted goals. Do we expect increases in street parking? Marginally, here and there, these may happen. Street parking generally is accounted for in a lot of the design of streets, not every streets. We have some narrow ones. Street parking slows vehicles in neighborhoods, creating more aware and safe driving behavior. And then when we briefed the city council on this in September, the council called up staff from Dallas Fire Department and Dallas Police Department asking, is this going to be a considerable barrier to you doing your duties? And they said, really no, we can do our duties of keeping the city safe and addressing fire emergencies without street parking being a problem. Will the TDMP review burden development, add unpredictability, and slow down development of housing and business? It is intended to do the exact opposite, add predictability by transparently stating expectations right up front that the city is already bringing up at the table when these development projects come in. Cities with TDMP reviews have reported success in avoiding new traffic from new development. I was just reading about Cambridge, Minnesota. I think it was Arlington, Virginia. They had a growth of 36,000 new dwelling units, and their vehicle miles traveled increased by 2.3%. So a relatively low percent for how many new residents they had. The proposed TDMP is very light touch. Again, I'd encourage you to look at Austin's, look at Denver's, look at San Francisco's, Minneapolis and St. Paul's. These are used all over the country, and ours is very simple, very direct, and all of our implementation is intended to be very direct and very easy to use. That's our presentation for the day. One thing that we're wanting to do with code amendments in general is when we bring them to the CPC, allow the Zoning Ordinance Advisory Committee chair just to make a statement, a summary statement about the discussion. This spent a long time at ZOAC, so we thought it was appropriate. I've asked Commissioner Housewright to make a short statement on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Housewright.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Wade, for a great briefing. I'm really proud of what staff and ZOAC have done on this topic so far. I think this has this amended ordinance has the potential to do more good for the city in terms of land use and urban design than anything else we'll do at this horseshoe today. This is really, really important. As a practicing commercial architect, the first thing you do when you start a project is figure out how to solve parking before you ever even design the building. And it really shouldn't have to be that way. We consistently build 20 to 30% more parking in our projects than is needed. And so I'm a big supporter of this ordinance. I would encourage everyone here to dig into this draft and correspond with Michael, correspond with Dr. Udrea with your questions. Get answers to your questions. Talk about any potential edits you see with them. I would love to see us treat this, frankly, with some urgency. Appreciate all the work that's gone into this so far, and really for the ZOAC committee that worked on this long before I was ever appointed to ZOAC. I'm still kind of a rookie at ZOAC, and so there's a whole lot of work that went on before I ever came on the scene. So I, in part, get to take credit for things that I didn't do. So thanks for your attention and study on this. I'll give it back to you, Chair.
Thank you, sir. Questions, Commissioner Hall?
Mr. Wade, thank you. I served on that ZOAC committee for 4 years, so this brings back a lot. You mentioned reduction of gasoline-powered vehicle trips. These days, we have a lot of hybrid vehicles. We're introducing electrical vehicles. Is it reduction of gasoline vehicles only, or is it just vehicle traffic in general?
Thank you, Commissioner, for the question. It's both. And so generally speaking, people are driving mostly still gasoline-powered vehicles. The reason that we say single-occupant gasoline-powered vehicle trips, both of them matter when it comes to transportation and environmental impact. So if someone decides to move from their gas-powered vehicle to an electric vehicle because a development provided a charging facility, something like that makes it very convenient, environmental win, they're still out driving on the roads, and so maybe the safety impact isn't there, but as far as our environmental goals, that's something. If someone is driving a gasoline-powered vehicle alone and they decide to continue driving that one, but they're carpooling now, then that's another car that's off the road because they have a pedestrian, so that also contributes to city goals. So it's a both-and situation.
Any other questions, Commissioner Carpenter?
Well, I mean, I could ask questions for hours, but I know it's not appropriate today. At what point are we going to be given the full body of all these various components of this?
Sure. So all of the text amendment is online. The report to ZOAC is online. The revisions I've just introduced today, I can sort of give a written description of those. The TDMP guide portion of that, that's, again, at about 75%, and that's kind of utmost priority in what we're working out right now. Its final form will be online, but right now it's a PDF, and so that draft in its draft form, happy to send out as well.
You say it's at 75% at this time. When are you anticipating it being complete? Or complete subject to whatever revisions happen as it goes through the process?
Sure. The main things that are being tweaked right now are the numbers of the points. And so this is something that I will be leaving this room and working on. Would love for it to be within the next 7 to 10 business days. In the end, there will need to be some leadership review of it as well. And so I don't have a date for you. I think if we want to talk to PDD leadership and really establish a hard date that can be very predictable, then that can be worth doing.
Are you anticipating weeks, months?
Weeks.
Weeks, thank you. Following up, I did listen to the last two ZOAC meetings I watched the videos of the last two ZOAC meetings on parking, and I know there were a fair number of questions about the preservation of custom parking requirements within PDs. And your presentation today seemed to also indicate that those were going to be, intact unless the PD was written that it just deferred to 51A. But when I read the proposed ordinance, there was text added to the ordinance that said that the director had the right to alter the parking requirements in any PD at that person's discretion, which seemed to undermine what is in this presentation and what was told to ZOAC. So where does that stand now? Has the proposed ordinance been modified?
No, it hasn't. So to clarify, in saying that it affects or doesn't affect PDs, that's just the changing of the minimum that's in 51A to 0. So the language that is in 51A about exceptions, so currently it can be a 5% reduction, it can be a 10% reduction, there's a limit on that. That is in the proposed ordinance, and that's proposed to remain. And so insofar as that exception can affect a PD, then it still can. And I think I might turn it over to Dr. Udrea.
Yeah, we legally cannot change what's in an ordinance. So unless the ordinance gives the director any discretion, exactly what Michael was saying, sending back to 51A when it comes to reductions and stuff like that. But no, this code amendment is not intending to change PDs.
I have to take a look at the text that was there, but moving on to the question about attempting to reduce the number of single occupancy vehicle trips, how does that correlate to the seeming increase in the number of businesses that seem to be going to drive-through only? Because how would a traffic demand management program and a point system seem to be, the goals of that would seem to be in opposition to the goals of a drive-through business, which would seem to want as many passenger vehicles moving through regardless of how many occupants there are?
Sure, and I agree with that concern, and what you're approaching is really the bounds of the scope of the amendment that we're looking at. And so what we can affect is parking and parking regulations, and then for our TDMP program, we're requiring a major review, so that's a traffic impact analysis, sustainable modes analysis report, et cetera, for anything that adds a drive-through or drive-in component. What this particular study isn't intended to affect is where drive-throughs are located. That would be a different study, I think.
Where drive-throughs are on the site, or where drive-throughs are allowed to exist as a land use?
Well, I was thinking second, but both, really.
Okay, thank you. I'll defer to other questioners.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Kingston?
Well, like Commissioner Carpenter, I could probably spend the rest of today on this, but we won't. You sort of sidestepped a question. I represent Lois Greenville, and we use parking to manage the balance of uses. It's really the only way we can do it legally under state law. And if we eliminate parking minimums, I anticipate that what we now have as neighborhood serving retail establishments in neighborhood services will become more bars and restaurants with the attendant issues that we had seen in the past when we passed PD 842. So how does eliminating all parking minimums benefit Lois Greenville and communities like that?
Thank you for the question. In general, we've seen a difference in which, speaking before I'm thinking which direction to go. So very general, there probably will be a couple of new restaurants there. If it's bars, you have the SUP requirement, so you get to review everything about the site plan and the site and see if that fits in there. The on-street parking and loading, on-street parking and curb management plan, we see as the most appropriate tool for a targeted neighborhood, one corridor, and of course the neighborhood outside of that. We know that there are conservation districts in the area too with parking minimums, and we know that there are PDs in the area as well. And so generally speaking, we would point, and we have pointed in the past to the Department of Transportation and Public Works and then the tools that are in their proposed policy as the best way to impact one area while we're looking at something that is impacting the city. And I think I would turn it also, let's start with Dr. Udrea, and then.
Yeah, thank you for the question. You know, I've been saying this in the past too. Like parking is about cars and driving cars. Land use is land use. So I would love for this to kind of like be detached. As Michael was saying, SUP, bars requires SUPs. There are a lot of other zoning or land use mechanisms to address the nuisance that comes with the land use. When it comes to the benefits of allowing the flexibility of right sizing, it depends on the area. I would think that the question for a neighborhood would be like, do you prefer an empty parking lot or a parking lot versus a business or more housing or something that has eyes on the street? So it's a matter of what do you want the city to be? Do you want the city to be cars and parking lots, or do you want the city to be, again, usable uses, eyes on the streets, people using those uses, as opposed to, I keep on saying, we can just look outside the window and we can count the parking lots in downtown and ask, is this what we want for the city? So that would be a question. I'm sorry, like, it's a code amendment, we're not necessarily talking about vision, but also I would caution us to say we want parking requirements just because we don't want these uses. Then let's talk about those uses when we are going to do the code reform, instead of incentivizing people to drive and have more unintended consequences versus addressing the nuisance of the uses, the potential nuisance of the uses head on.
And I have one last thing on the land use thing. So just like Michael mentioned, bars require SUPs, but restaurants, when they're within 330 feet of a residential zoning district, will require a residential adjacency review. It is an administrative review, but very typical conditions that are put on restaurant RARs are hours of operation, patio limitations, or maybe prohibitions, just depending on how the layout is looking. And also no speakers outside, and so they can address sound and, you know, just kind of the operational aspects of restaurants that are within 330 feet of single-family districts, which is already in the code. That doesn't need any code reform right now. But part of the problem is that people don't have enough parking to be considered a restaurant. You know, they don't have one space per 100 square feet of floor area. So they instead change their business model and become this to-go only situation, which probably still has all the impact, but no RAR requirement. So there are some built-in protections for restaurants and bars in neighborhoods that, you know, could address a lot of these concerns. And maybe it's another conversation we need to have. You know, maybe there's some better practices for RARs, but, you know, I think Andrea and all the staff that, you know, performs RAR reviews, and I know that we've had an RAR on Lower Greenville that the restaurant did not like, and so they appealed it to CPC, and I'm pretty sure that one was denied. So there are protections already built in for restaurants and bars next to neighborhoods, regardless of parking.
Well, look, I'm not going to take up all of our time on this today. I'm clearly not sold. But what I will ask the next time we talk about this is how a modified delta overlay might come into play. So I would ask that you all consider that as well. I'm not sure that there's more than one in the city. I'm aware of one, and the nature of that and what that means for that community. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Kingston. Yes, sir.
Mr. Wade, thank you
Sharno.
for your presentation. My turn?
Yes, I'm sorry.
You had mentioned Chapter 51 and 51A were reducing to 0, but you didn't mention anything about Article 13. Can you speak to how this will affect Article 13?
It will affect Article 13 in exactly the same way. It's Article 13 of 51A, and so it would apply to everything there as well, yes.
Commissioner Wheeler, followed by Commissioner Hampton.
We've gone through the South Dallas area plan, the task force that was created. One of the things that we did, we held off on looking at parking requirements because we were hoping that ZOAC would have been further along. We have kind of the opposite of what's going on in Lower Greenville. We can't use our current parking out front that kind of mimics Jefferson, Lower Greenville, and some of those older areas. As a park, we can use it as parking, but we can't use it in our parking agreement. And by not being able to use it in our parking agreement, it has created a it's part of the reason that we have so many empty buildings that could be utilized for businesses, but because they're they don't have enough parking or they can't utilize the parking that is used every day. How soon would that affect those particular areas? Because PD 595 reverts back to 51A. And how close are you all working with Andrea and long-term planning for this type of situation? We're landlocked and we don't have any other options for additional parking, but we do have a lot of empty buildings. And the number one reason is they don't have the parking that was built at the time that they had, that the building was built, can no longer be used as part of required spaces in the parking agreement.
Thank you, Commissioner, for the question. So anywhere that 51A parking minimums are relied upon, this proposal would just remove the need to have required parking. And so whether the restaurant still needs to use that parking agreement for parking that will be based on the operation, but it sounds like the parking agreements are getting in the way of the operation of buildings or the adaptable reuse of those buildings. This proposal would just remove the need for that at all. And so we have been working with Andrea, we've been working with the area planning team, the neighborhood planning team, in looking at PD 595 in particular. We know that there's some very important corridors down there that do need additional flexibility, need some additional some livening up that we're looking forward to with all of the attention that they've been given. And so this proposal, insofar as 595 refers to 51A, would just remove some of those constraints that lead to those parking agreements in the first place.
Okay, and but you all did say that the can currently, if this is not approved prior to the PD 595 and the area plan coming before CPC, it can, and can Lindsay and Patrick go ahead and include or taking in consideration what we've asked for parking as far as reduction? I own one of those buildings. My clients never park in the back. They only park out front, very seldom unless we get a large, and I just have an office, and I never needed the parking in the rear.
So as part of the plan that they're creating, that's not any kind of code amendment, but my understanding is that that will be followed up immediately with an authorized hearing, and that would be an opportunity to look at the parking requirements in PD 595.
Okay, I thank you, because we've been definitely waiting on ZOAC for quite some time. We even considered not even talking about our the changes we needed for parking, because ZOAC, we were thinking we were reinventing the wheel since ZOAC had already been working on it. We've been 5 years in, and you all been in 6 or 7. Thank you.
Commissioners,
If I may, Mr. Chair?
Commissioner Hampton, thank you.
Sir. I think we're having some technical challenges at the moment, so thank you. Mr. Wade, thank you for the presentation. I wanted to follow up on Commissioner Wheeler's question. I had a couple of other items on parking agreements, and I think it's very common in a lot of our older areas of town. I can think of 3 different retail areas in my district where effectively there's parking in the public right-of-way. It serves these older businesses. They also have the parking agreements. And I think what I understood you to say is that the parking agreements will be evaluated based on whatever the new requirements are that are passed. Potentially, if there's no minimums, then there would be no parking. But then how would that be subject to this transportation management and curb management plan? Because effectively, there is no curb management. The curb management is the right-of-way parking that serves those businesses. So is that anything that staff has evaluated, or is that something that can be part of our next evaluation of this?
Sure, thank you. So the purpose of the TDMP isn't to impact curb parking. That's the on-street parking and curb management plan that Department of Transportation and Public Works is. So that's just in general, the scope of that is to look at trips generated. It is to look at parking demand, but it's not intended to look at the on-street parking or agreements that have been that pertain to that. Am I understanding the question correctly?
Well, I think, and maybe I need to dig in a little bit more on the details, but I thought what I understood was that traffic demand management would establish what would be required or what provisions they hit the point system, but that a part of that was the curb management review. Is that not part of it? And I understand it's two separate things, but I thought they went hand in hand.
Yeah, I think conceptually they do. The TDMP is not intended to do a curb management review. And so there are strategies in the TDMP that a developer could choose to achieve their point total. For instance, how they arrange loading on site, how they, again, how they design parking on site. This is something worth another think. But no, the TDMP is not intended to affect or regulate on-street parking.
And I guess I may need to clarify because it's, I guess, could be considered on-street parking, but it's actually parking spaces that are shared. They're essentially split between the property and the public right-of-way. That's just functionally how they developed. And I'll send you a few examples. It's just something that I think there's probably a lot of areas of town where this occurs, where we have older retail. And you touched on one of the other things I wanted to ask about. When you talked about loading, you mentioned that it would simply be reviewed at planning for whether it was off-street or on-street loading. I would say as someone who regularly navigates from East Dallas to downtown, I'm familiar with how on-street loading works or doesn't work. And I guess this may be, again, more of the curb management review versus the traffic review, but I think it might be helpful to understand that. I've seen everything from U-Haul trucks to dumpsters being parked out in the public right-of-way, which I know is not currently allowed by code, but is happening. But as we're looking at this, it would be helpful to understand just how we're overall thinking about using our right-of-way, because I think part of what I'm hearing, we're trying to reimagine how we're doing it so it's more effective for everyone in our city. So if you guys can just take a look at that, and again, I'm happy to share a few examples. I think one of the other things I wanted to understand is as you guys are looking at the traffic demand, how are areas that aren't served by public transit being considered? How does that work within the point system?
Sure, in a couple of ways. So first of all, just even before the point system, this is just codifying our view. So even before the point system, before the incentive structure, the kind of required incentive structure, this is about being predictable and adding transparency to what we're going to ask anyway. But you're right, there will be a group of single-family homes that are by no bus routes, no bicycle infrastructure, nothing like that. In those situations, if really no TDMP incentives make any sense at all, and we don't think that they would, open up options for users or for residents, et cetera, then we have the waiver process, we have the exemption process. This is meant to be very light and not burdensome, but it is meant to look for opportunities. And that's really the overarching sentiment is just show us when you come to us with your 20-unit apartment building that's by nothing at all, and there are no city plans to do anything, show us that that's the case. That's sensible. That's a matter of the land use and the local transportation system. And so we have, part of the provision in there is an exemption possibility, a waiver possibility.
Well, and I'll use maybe an opposite example, and it was something that is part of PD, does refer back to base code, and it was new development on Riverfront. There is no bus transit. There's not anything there today. This body passed it. We agreed that it was a great opportunity to get ahead of gentrification in the area, to get affordable housing on the ground. And we actually built in trying to think about how in the future, as redevelopment is coming, it was at the tail end of CADIS, we know Convention Center, a lot of other things happening in the area. Again, I'm trying to take what you're talking about and look into the future and understand how some of these things are going to be thought about when we move to a citywide application, because that one was obviously able to be tailored. We're now moving that into, I think, a process for all developers to take advantage of that versus having to go through a plan development or what the other, tools that we do have available or future tools that we'll have. But I don't think it's only single family. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for different types of development. So again, just an example to maybe understand how those types of projects will be thought about. And one final question had to do with, where's my notes? And it's just going back to a question that you asked, because I know it was a lot of the conversations that I had early on in this. You know, a lot of our tools that we use are incentive tools. And so we target, whether it's reductions, whether it's MIHDB, on trying to incentivize the types of developments. You mentioned Buffalo, where they're really seeing it in the mixed-use projects, you know, using that approach versus saying no minimums, and then here's what we think the outcome would be. But could you just give a little bit more context on why we don't think using, whether it's an economic development corridor, whether it's housing, you know, whether it's mixed-use projects, that we don't focus this where we really want to see our investment go versus the citywide approach?
I can take a crack at that. This is a year 2040, year 2060, 2080 kind of conversation. And when digging into the data around this, it gets sparse in sort of comparing these different strategies. So what would a 365 square mile deletion of parking minimums mean compared to an unknown number of projects going through MIHDB, that kind of a thing, and in PDs with lower parking minimums. So there's not much data for us to sink our teeth in making that kind of discernment. I think that's, as we've sort of created this tool, that's a matter of what system do we want to pursue, and kind of a policy conversation. That's been our attitude about it. It's my attitude. I think Dr. Udrea wanted to say something. She was making moves like she did.
Yeah, I will go back to the vision. Like, obviously, it's also a little bit of transparency. It's hard to have regulations for small businesses, small developments that are not sophisticated enough to apply incentives. And then you need to, at some point, recognize, as I said, what is the unintended consequence of having a one-size-fits-all ratio that is completely insensitive to location or development type. It's you're going to get more cars. So if that's the message that is for this city, like, yeah, we need parking to make sure that everybody drives, then that's the vision that we have for the city. If not, we're going to have to work towards design standards, towards saying, no, I care, as I said, more about walkability, about safe streets, about where the driveway goes. When you require parking, you're going to get cars. You're going to get 30-foot wide drive approaches stabbing into your sidewalks. You're going to get front yards that are completely concrete just because you need access to those parking spaces. So we have this parking requirements since the 1960s. In 2012, we increased them. And now let's go around the city and see, do they work? What did we get? Is the city more walkable? Is the city safer for bikes? Is the city safer for pedestrians? Do we have more opportunities for transit? Well, if we don't, it means that we need to change the approach. Because this incentive approach has been in the books for 40 years. Does it work? As I said, let's go in the flag room and look outside and count the number of surface parking lots in downtown. And downtown has reduced requirements and incentives. Does it work? So it goes back to the vision and the question that you have in front of you. What do we want from our city?
Well, thank you for that. I would also just observe in the case of downtown, I think we have other challenges that have led to a lot of the surface parking lots that exist there, having watched a number of those buildings come down, sadly. But I don't disagree that certainly parking is a component of creating, or how we address parking as a component of how we address walkable cities. I guess one thing I do want to make, and again, I think it's not parking related, but curb management related. You mentioned the example of the 30-foot drive aisles serving. That wouldn't actually be prohibited with what's in front of us, though, would it?
I think we have one of the design standards where we try to limit that. And we also have other type of design standards that we want to bring forward. that's the exact purpose of, okay, let's look at quality of parking, quality of access to your lot, as opposed to like, you need 500 parking spots. I would say, yes, we would address that the same we would address that with impervious surface. But as I said, like right now, because parking is tied to the use, it's really impossible to occupy historical structures, pre-existing conditions with uses. It's really hard, exactly what Commissioner Wheeler was saying, is really hard to make it work, because that's not how the city behaves, that's not how the uses behave. So I would say, yes, we do address that. We do have condition to minimize the width of driveways and distance between those. That type of quality we want to talk about, not, okay, you need 1,000 parking spots. As I said, when a developer comes in and we say, oh, we would like for you to have a 6-foot sidewalk and street trees and parking behind the building, and where's your doorstop? And they said, I need 1,000 parking spots, or I need 100 parking spots. Okay, access to downtown garage ramp, access to above ramp means double driveways. So we are not actually making it work, because parking is going to trump everything else that we want to build in the city.
Thank you, but I just, and I appreciate all the context. So it's related, but it's not, or well, this helps unlock the ability to have the design standards that would lead to the change. Thank you.
Without a doubt. Thank you.
Commissioner Blair, followed by Commissioner Herbert.
Thank you, and I would like to piggyback on something that Commissioner Hampton said about non-urban areas in the city. I have the largest, if not probably, well, I have the largest non-urban area in the city who also does not have any means of public transportation. My district only has one DART rail line in over 50 square miles. And it has very little connectivity to jobs when you look at the inland port. Actually, and when you look at my western area, DART has 95% left the community. So the only means we have is using a car. And although we do use urban standards, and staff tries to use urban standards in our rural area, and we have a plan that's outdated, and we've been waiting for 5 years to update it, to possibly incorporate some of the standards that the city would like for housing. But what we find is, because our housing is also extremely affordable in comparison to a lot of areas in the city, it's still not affordable enough. And because there's no public transportation, we also see 5 and 6 cars to one household with not enough parking. And because the commercial areas are designed more urbanish, they park on the street because there's still not enough parking. Because in order to get to them, they have to drive. So we don't get the bonuses because the developers don't come and offer those, those incentives are not appropriate in my area. So it seems with what you're saying, my district would be left with no incentives, and on the mercy of developers and builders and architects who appreciate the needs of the community in which they're building to. How can we write, how can we, and let me also say, I appreciate the parking changes that are required. I appreciate that there are developers who park and who build and who are considerate of the needs of the community. But how do we codify that in the reduction, or in making it that there's no minimums, when we are seeing that we have some needs that aren't being met?
Sure, thank you. When we look generally at the numbers of car ownership by income, car ownership drops off dramatically in the state of Texas and in America as you reach about, I think it's 55–40% of AMI. And so there definitely are those households with 6 cars. You're right, they're parking on the curb. Generally speaking, when most of the households at that affordability go to the grocery store, they're paying extra prices, and the image on the bottom of the screen is a grocery store parking lot. They're paying extra for their groceries because the developer had to build those parking spaces that mostly sit unused. And so I think we can kind of compare individual intersections, individual shopping centers, et cetera, but overall we have a horribly large amount of spaces that are unused. And so are these the locations that any given household needs to go? I don't know. That's up to the household, but these are grocery stores, these are salons, these are church parking lots, these kinds of things. And overall, as these land uses come through our TDMP process, we look at those and we say, again, these aren't parking minimums, but this is expected, this is a big trip generator. It's expected to draw 100, 120, 130 trips per hour at the peak hour. What can we do with this, and how can we guide this developer to do it in such a way that people don't need to drive here as much? And so again, we're looking at the data of who owns cars. We see greater car ownership at the higher income levels, and it's those folks who really benefit from having kind of free and abundant parking everywhere in the city. And so if that's a place that's staff can bring more data just to sort of discuss the topic of car ownership and affordability, we can do that.
And I will continue the answer, sorry about that. I would say that, first of all, like, having a code that doesn't require parking minimum, it doesn't mean that you cannot provide parking, and obviously parking will be provided for whatever the demands of the market. You know, everything has to be viable, right? Because what can kill a business is a requirement that's unrealistic and unaligned with the context of the area, or not providing it when the neighbors or the customers need it. So I would say that it will continue to be provided. We have induced the demand for driving in the city for so long, we will for sure continue to see parking being provided in abundant amounts, because that's what happens. And then I will make a comment. The no parking minimum provision in a code is not something that it's urban. Anchorage, Alaska eliminated their minimums, and I don't know if they have transit at all. It has nothing to do with transit. It has to do with all behaviors, shorter distances, having services closer to your house that don't have added cost. It has to do with limiting the impervious surface. Like, we surely don't want those rural areas to become surface parking lots, right? We want them to become sensitive to their context and continue to serve the community. And I will also make a comment. I grew up in a rural area, and parking was not required because people by nature walk, bike, and also drive. So there are way more modes of transportation than just cars and transit. There is a lot of there's a microorganism in any neighborhood where you need your daily needs, and you can walk or you can bike, or again, if need be, you can drive to them. So I would say that humans by nature don't necessarily drive, and rural communities, as we see, that's why before the 60s we didn't have parking requirements, because it is natural to actually balance the way you behave or you use the city. So I would just like to detach. No minimums has nothing necessarily to do with urban. It is just about, as I would say, the way the community can use the area immediately around them.
And I wanted to build on that. And what I heard you say was also you would like more thoughtful design in your part of town. And I think that's on the horizon. We are, this contains a very light touch of design standards that I think would be good for all areas of the city. Minimal drive approaches and, some things that we can make an argument that they're related to the CPC authorization of off-street parking and loading. But other things are kind of outside that, authorization. So we can't do a whole lot for really extensive design standards of building types and whole site designs. But, as you do know, we do have the impervious surface code amendment coming up after we figure out what happens with parking. So I think that's going to give a lot of good tools in our tool belt to discuss and work on those design standards and things that I think could really help.
I'm going to move to a different area of my district, and before I go back to the rural side, I go to a church that, because we're limited in parking, we've had to go to multiple services. We have over 10,000 members, and when we try to leave and try to get them in, and everybody, if you want to get there, because it's the only way you get there is with a car. It's not walkable. It's none of that. It actually could benefit from a parking structure. But it's also where we have our largest, or in our one of our more progressive mixed-use area and we're utilizing those parking spaces the best that we can. But we still find that there are moments and times where the parking lot is 100% full. So it too does not lend itself to to what you're saying. But going back to my rule, if you look at the rule, we need horse parking, especially on the week. No, I'm serious. On the weekend, you can't drive. On the weekends, there's streets you can't drive on because there are horses on it. And that's part of my community. We have over 500 horses just in that area. And they don't bike, they ride horses or they drive. So it's a really unique area that has very unique needs, that we have unique appreciations for what is being offered to them. It looks as though they are not being heard. So I just ask that when we talk about any type of parking for my rural area, that we're considerate, we're really considerate that you don't take a general concept and try to apply it to a very unique and specific district. Thank you.
Commissioner Herbert? Yeah, I won't belittle a lot of the points that have been made. My district is unique, I think, in a lot of ways because of the large apartment complexes that we have and the overflow of parking onto the streets and neighborhoods of communities. Living in my district, living in District 4, being, let's say, making lower than the poverty line or under $40,000 within the last 5 years, if you don't have a car in the southern sector, you're not successful. Our buses don't align with our community unless we're going to work in Plano. It takes an hour to get there. I can get to Plano faster than I can get downtown from the VA hospital. That's a problem. I get it. This is great. I get it. I get the idea of it. Merging it with our Dallas, talking about other things that we're doing to make our areas livable. It's an overall picture, but it's going to take an overall organization, DART, national organizations, state organizations, regulations. Even in District 3, near the Wheatland Cemetery, if I want to go from that Wheatland Cemetery or the Old Methodist Church to the Social Security office, which in hindsight doesn't look far, the blocks are tremendously long. There's not even, biking will take effort, right? We have a very unique city in the southern sector that was built in a very unique way that it's going to take decades to correct. And I believe this is a start. This can help, but it has to be with the overall picture, especially when it comes to the amount of apartment and overflow parking that we have to deal with today. I have a case today. The street, I think, is 26 feet wide. Guy drives a dually truck. He can't get out of his parking lot today when another car is parked on the street. One car is parked on the street. If two's there, it's impossible. He has to knock on his neighbor's door to get out today in Oak Cliff. So I get it. I think there's areas where this will work, but I also think that there's areas of concern that exist today that we need to have a plan to bring urban living, more mixed use, more mixed development to that area so people can survive. The first thing I did after Hurricane Katrina was try to get from the convention center to my new apartment in Fair Oaks Crossing, right? I lost my wallet that day. I mean, it was a fight. I literally got in the cab, went to Dallas Chrysler and Jeep, and was like, I need a car. I don't care what you do. Of course, I got a 26% interest rate and some other things that I'm probably still paying for today. But neither here or there, it was impossible to go to 5 appointments in one day to get on your feet in Dallas. It's just hard for poor people not to have a car and be successful. And I say that to the car count in Dallas. Most people in Dallas, this is why Pleasant Grove is so popular, right? The car lots of Grand Prairie. These car lots are successful because poor people need vehicles to survive in this city. So yes, I believe we're on to something here, but it's going to take an overall approach. And without DART at the table, builders at the table, developers at the table to make an urban environment, we're a long way. So I just wanted to get that out. I don't think there's a response to that, but thank you for the presentation. We just really, this, to me, doesn't speak to the southern sector or provide benefits in the short term. Thank you.
Any other questions, commissioners? Second round, Commissioner Carpenter.
You said that if a spillover problem was identified, the property owners, operators would be required to come back and work with the staff. Is that accurate, first of all?
That's a recommended revision at this time. Yep.
Okay, if that recommendation is enacted, what mechanism or tools or teeth would you see, what strategies would staff have to address that sort of issue?
So we do this already. It just takes a lot of complaining up to the city council member. The city council member comes down and tells Department of Transportation engineers, we need to figure this out, redesign the streets. And so when you talk to some of our engineers, Fernando and others, they spend a lot of their time doing free engineering work sort of already. And so what this looks like is an expectation of that you're going to be on the hook, pizza restaurant or something else, if and when this goes south. And I'll stop there.
You're talking about an anticipated spillover problem. You're not talking about a spillover problem that develops because something went in with not enough parking or whatever, because, and there's a problem at that point. What retroactively could be done?
Sure. Well, and to be clear, I'm saying the code in there will let people know that we're going to retroactively come back to you. And so as far as the tools, I think Andrea has a response.
Yeah, I think that goes back to parking quantity versus management or quality. As you know, for instance, the code right now allows you to do those mud charts. We're familiar with them, right? We put them in the PD. It means that if, for instance, in a retail strip or let's say in areas that are one lot and you have multiple uses, if they have mutually exclusive hours, they can use the same parking spots. It's just a better use of existing parking that you have on the spot. If you have situations where you can do remote parking or you can do share parking, those are already codified right now. But because you have required, you can only do that for whatever is in excess. So developers or whatever operators, small businesses may go back to what are my hours of operation. So it naturally, the intent of adding, as I was saying, that's also an incentive. The intent of adding those incentives in the code is to encourage and support mixed use. The reality is that you can't if you have a big required ratio. If you don't have the ratio required, those mix of uses and that sharing of goods, we envision and we hope that it will happen. So what can happen is they can, again, we can get on the same table with the operator and look around their area, and with our engineering department, look around the area and look around the uses that there are there and see, okay, can you come to an agreement to your neighbor? Do you not use the same or the entire parking that you have on the spot? Are there any remote lots that you're not using? There are so many ways to manage parking that are happening sometimes. Ad hoc, or they go through the hoops of 7, I'm not going to make a snarky comment, of the existing code to convince the director that it's happening already. I keep on saying we're talking about probably this problematic or high intensity uses happen at limited points in time. The parking sits there empty for more than it's being used. It's just a matter of how can you share, how can you better utilize the land that is already developed with parking.
I understand that, but I guess what I'm envisioning in my area are some of the small, say you have a cluster of existing small structures that right now are underutilized or lightly utilized because they can't meet parking. If all of a sudden there are no parking requirements and you fill them up with businesses that need a lot of parking, and then you get spillover into the neighborhood where maybe they're using all the parking for blocks and blocks and blocks around, where's the strategy at that point?
Oh, so we're talking about the curb parking. As I was saying, and and I know, but I would like to point out there are a lot of curb management mechanisms or tools that already exist, and there are others that were created with our curb management policy that was just voted by City Council. As I said, maybe, and we talked about this years ago, before the curb management policy or curb management plan, I don't know how they call it, was voted. You can put no parking or resident parking only, or parking management districts that are supposed to start working. There are a lot of tools that can be used for curb management. And as I said, like if it becomes a hazard when it comes to situations like that, like no parking at the curb is gonna have to be enforced. So it is a different conversation that we had 4 years ago, because right now we do have a curb management policy, because right now Department of Transportation is very aware. They started to implement that, and they have any other tools that they are looking into implementing. So I would say that overall the city is looking at its curb space a little bit as that's valuable space, but it's also space that needs to be better regulated or better used. So, yeah, that would be a discussion with what can we do when it comes to curb management.
I'll just add that it's a very tricky situation in areas that, like I have in West Dallas and District 6, when you have neighborhoods, single-family neighborhoods that have high utilization of curb parking simply because of the number of vehicles that the family has, and then you're sandwiched in between heavy commercial and industrial areas that also tend to spill over. It gets complicated. But my final question will be about the applicability of all of this to industrial areas, especially industrial areas that have close proximity to residential areas, because there's really not going to be any way you're going to substantially reduce large truck traffic coming to these businesses. It's just what they do. Now, sure, maybe the employees could do something else, but you're going to have it's going to be almost impossible to make any reasonable, significant reduction. And so for the areas that are close to that, queuing is already a problem. If you have an industrial business or heavy commercial business that goes in that has lots and lots of truck traffic coming, and there's not enough, all of a sudden, no parking minimums, what's going to be done about making sure there's enough space for queuing that they can actually handle on their site without, because I have numerous businesses that just flow over onto the commercial streets I have transmission repair shops that use every curb parking space for 3 blocks around. Is there any way out of this?
I don't know the answer to your last question. Is there any way out of this? I'm going to give a partial answer to the preceding question. So you're right that the incentives are really about maybe the employee, at best, the employees that work there. It's not really intended to address the drive-through customers or the truckers who work at these shops. That's the incentives. For the review, the goal is that with our thresholds of commercial square footage, et cetera, guiding certain land uses straight into traffic impact analysis. So they have to show all of this beyond just a bare site plan review. They need to be showing us how they're going to manage all of this. And so there will be refinement of those thresholds. There will be refinement of maybe some strategies and the incentives can impact something like that, something like queuing. But overall, the more that we can usher significant traffic generators into the in-depth portion of the TDMP review, the better. And so whether that's playing with the square footage, something else, we can do that. I had another note, but I'm forgetting. Go ahead.
I would just add that the conversation about truck routes in the city has been happening, at least since I started with the city, right? I think it's, again, a Department of Transportation and a thoroughfare plan discussion. We have been talking, the code does say that identify some truck routes, but we all know the reality is not that. But I would say that conversation about trucks and truck routes and industrial areas, that is a conversation with the new thoroughfare plan, and I'm hoping that it's going to happen soon, and it's that conversation, because I don't see how that is. I mean, it may have a little bit of a connection, a little bit of a tangent with our parking code amendment. However, it all goes back to the truck routes and all where the trucks can actually travel in the city, and the fact that they can go on every city street. It's problematic, but it's a Department of Transportation conversation.
If I may, I wasn't so much concerned about the streets they're parking on as where they end up, to make sure they have enough, there's some kind of review going on that with the anticipated amount of truck traffic that they have and the time it takes for trucks to get loaded and transact their business and leave, that there needs to be some, I guess a better review or more intensive review than what's going on now to make sure that their sites have enough, I'll call it parking space, or queue lanes or whatever to accommodate. That's where I was.
I wholeheartedly agree. As I keep on saying, that's why I envision truck routes master plan, or I don't even know designation, because obviously the intensity and the location of your operation depends if you do have access to a truck route. So the answer to that I know, but we're talking about the future, and ideally would be that uses that need truck traffic and that amount of truck maneuvering should not be located where they don't have a truck route. So it's a little bit a different route. Yes, maybe this use is allowable or is allowed at that location. However, you cannot operate it. So maybe it's not the best location that you can find for that. And what I'm trying to say is that the way you can somehow force that location is by having a designated truck route.
Commissioner Wheeler.
One of the things that I left off, y'all, I'm sorry, I'm sick today, so I didn't want to get you all sick, so I didn't want to come in. So I think when you're talking about curb control, the biggest issue with PD 595 is not so much that we need a parking reduction. It is the amount that our parking starts 25 feet from the curb. So if you have a vital business that has multiple suites and they already can't, because of the 25 feet from the curb, their front parking is not allowable. Then 25 feet from the curb, if they're on two streets, particularly I have a family member who has a building that's on Malcolm X and Reed Lane. When we went in to get some certificate of occupancy for other suites, in order for, we had to do a signed letter saying that we wouldn't rent out any more suites because we didn't have enough parking. And this building, and again, no one uses nothing but the front parking. The back parking is very seldomly used, but because of that 25 feet from the curb, I don't know if that's in 51A, because if I'm not mistaken, PD 595 reverts back to 51A, but that alone can cause an issue, especially in these older districts. And the southern sector is a little bit more, is a lot different than when you go northern, where there is a lot of infield, and in the southern sector we have a lot of open spaces. And how is the parking? We don't want it where the parking will deter future development. So how is that being addressed? Because I literally measured her building when I went to go do her plans, and it was 25 feet from the curb. Her first parking spot would almost hit the middle of her building, and so she was left short of enough spaces where people have parked for over 40 years without a problem.
Thank you for the question. If I understand correctly, you're talking about maybe a 25-foot setback required in PD 595. Andrea, do you know?
Yeah, I think that there is a proposal, and we're going to have a briefing on PD 595 or on South Dallas area plan pretty soon. So I think that would be addressed in PD 595. But I would say that, again, this is another thing. Like if you don't have a set required ratio, it will help in situations like this. This is another unintended consequence of having a high ratio and combined with design standards. That's why you need to basically keep the design standards and reduce the ratios or not have ratios so situations can solve themselves.
Okay. When we see buildings going up every single day with what is considered on-street parking, even though it's a cutout in front of it, whether that be parallel or just straight pull-in, and it's being built all over the city. When you have these older districts who are 100% being cut out because of some design, because of some changes. PD 595, currently the area plan, we are not addressing parking because we were hoping, we know there's an issue with our parking. It's the major one is the 25 feet from the curb, but we were waiting on ZOAC. So I don't necessarily believe that is going to be discussed because we revert back to 51A, and we would have to change it and not revert back to 51A and be more specific in PD 595 if we want it done sooner.
My
Test.
microphone test, yes.
No, I'm fine. I was asking you, maybe asking that question. Is that something that Lindsay and Patrick should be asking for the PD, or I mean, as far as the area, the area plan, or should we just wait on since our PD is wrote to revert to 51A property requirement?
Thank you for the question. I think it would be good to see what happens with this conversation, but I know that Patrick and Lindsay are listening and paying attention and can probably advise you best when it comes to that time.
Thank you very much. Commissioners, it is 10:51. We're going back to the way we used to do things around the City Plan Commission way back. If you need to take a break or refresh your coffee, just go ahead and do it. Just make sure to be mindful that we always have to have a quorum. Thank you very much, Mr. Wade. Appreciate it. We'll see you back on the 5th, December 5th. In the meantime, Commissioners, as always, if there's any questions, please reach out to staff and make sure that those get addressed. Commissioners, we're going to go ahead and keep moving. We'll go to the Lakewood expansion, Conservation District expansion. Good morning.
George, can I have
20.
Good morning, Commissioners.
Good morning.
This is Lakewood Conservation District, proposed expansion, case number Z212315. See if I can get rid of that. This process was initiated through a neighborhood committee, but the request is a City Plan Commission authorized hearing seeking a recommendation regarding a proposal to change the zoning classification from R75A and R10A single-family zoning district to the Lakewood Conservation District number 2, Tract 4. The area, subject area is located in East Dallas, just on the west side of White Rock Lake. The area is generally bounded by alleys between Westlake Avenue and Meadow Lake Avenue, and between Lakewood Boulevard and Westlake Avenue on the north, Lawther Drive on the east, Tokalon Drive, and the alleys between Tokalon Drive and both Pasadena Avenue and Avalon Avenue, and the alley between Lorna Lane and Avalon Avenue on the south, and Brendanwood Drive, Copperfield Lane, and the alley south of Westlake, and the Wendover Road on the west, and contains approximately 114.183 acres. The current zoning is R75A and R10A. We do have a individually designated historic property within the boundaries as well. The area is zoned single-family residential and has single-family residential both to the north and south of the area, and on the west is the Conservation District number 2. Also want to point out the other conservation districts and historic districts that are in the area, just for context in this conversation. In the surrounding area, we have the Tokalon Park just to the south on the east end of the proposed expansion area, the Filter Building and White Rock Lake Pump Station also to the east, Lakewood Elementary to the northwest, and then Conservation District number 2 to the west. These are just going to be some indicative photographs of the architecture that's found on the east-west streets in the proposed expansion area. Westlake Avenue, Lakewood Avenue, Lakeshore Avenue, Tokelon Avenue. And really, the conversation will center around why this Tract 4 should be included in the Lakewood Conservation District. It does fulfill all the purpose of a conservation district. This will be done as a result of a neighborhood-initiated process. The area meets all the required eligibility criteria and is also similar to and compatible with the physical attributes of the established CD2 Lakewood Conservation District. Contains numerous examples of significant architecture designed by notable Dallas architects and developers, and provides an appropriate regulatory structure for an area such as this. Just very briefly, what the purpose of a conservation district is to protect the physical attributes of an area or neighborhood, promote development or redevelopment that is compatible with an existing area or neighborhood, promote economic revitalization, enhance livability of the city, and ensure harmonious, orderly, and efficient growth. There are going to be some questions about the process, and so I'm just going to briefly touch on these. There will be more in the expanded hearing presentation later, but I do want to outline sort of all of the steps that took place to get us to this point. In April 2020, the Neighborhood Committee contacted the city about creating a conservation district. Staff held 2 meetings with the Neighborhood Committee in November of 21 and January of 2022 before accepting their determination of eligibility in April of 2022. Staff then provided petitions to the neighborhood. Ultimately, CPC will now be on a 10-minute break.
– 11:09 a.m. And we're back to you, sir.
And can you start over that last line, Trevor? The process?
Yeah, I think maybe a couple of slides back. Is that right, Commissioner Kingston? Maybe 2 slides back.
Yeah, so I actually went back a couple of slides, so we'll get to that.
So I think this is where we started having issues. Why Tract 4 should be included in the Lakewood Conservation District, besides the fact that it fulfills the purpose of a CD, as a result of a neighborhood-initiated process. The area meets all of the eligibility criteria and is similar to and compatible with the physical attributes of the established CD2. The area contains numerous examples of significant architecture designed by noted Dallas architects and developers, and a CD provides the appropriate regulatory structure for this type of endeavor. The purpose of a conservation district is, of course, to protect the physical attributes of an area or neighborhood, promote development or redevelopment that's compatible with an existing area or neighborhood, promote economic revitalization while enhancing the livability of the city and ensuring harmonious, orderly, and efficient growth. So I'll go through a little bit of the process and how the city engaged with the neighborhood. Initially, in April 2020, the neighborhood committee approached the city about possibly creating a CD. 2 meetings were held in November of 21 and January of 22 with the neighborhood committee to discuss those items that were intended to be discussed in the process. A determination of eligibility was accepted, which triggered the petitioning of the neighborhood. Ultimately, 189 petitions were submitted by the neighborhood committee for verification, which which came out to be 68% of the total property owners within the proposed boundaries. This triggered a series of neighborhood meetings. Ultimately, 15 neighborhood meetings were held to discuss the topics that were included on the petition before the staff used that information to draft an ordinance, which was presented initially in January of this year. 2 follow-up meetings were held to discuss the draft ordinance that was presented before a survey was posted online to gather additional input from those areas, those neighbors within the proposed boundaries. That ultimately led to a revised public draft being presented or posted to the website in September before we held our final neighborhood meeting to discuss the revisions that were made based on the input gathered after the first draft. This is a breakdown of the meetings that were held and the topics that were discussed. You'll see that in many instances, certain topics were continued over to another meeting. This reflects the items that were listed on the petition that the 68% of neighbors signed to initiate the process. And then you'll see, again, those 2 meetings in February to discuss the draft, first draft, before our last meeting on October the 29th. So we used a variety of methods to solicit input and feedback. Certainly during those 15-hour-and-a-half long public meetings, the discussions were documented by staff, but we also at each meeting handed out a comment sheet, and we have an example of that there in the lower right-hand corner to gather additional input if neighbors weren't willing to necessarily raise their hand and provide input or ask questions. They had the ability to do so on those comment sheets. Residents and staff alike both observed and reported conditions as it relates to the developmental and architectural features found within the neighborhood. And then at each meeting, staff's contact information was presented so we could get email or phone communications from anyone who wanted to provide input. So just as a quick summary, the proposed ordinance is a result of the neighborhood-initiated and guided process for establishing the conservation district. The proposed area does meet the eligibility criteria set forth in the Dallas City Code and is consistent with the goals of the Forward Dallas 2.0 Comprehensive Plan, as well as the recently adopted Preservation Plan. The proposed development architectural standards will help conserve the distinctive character of the neighborhood. And again, this area contains 87 examples as identified by the neighbors of significant architecture by either noted Dallas architects or developers. And again, this CD is the appropriate regulatory instrument for accomplishing the goals that were set forth by the neighbors. Staff's recommendation is approval, subject to the conditions of the Lakewood Conservation District Tract 4 zoning ordinance and illustrations, which are part of your packet.
Thank you, sir. Questions, commissioners? Commissioner Kingston.
I do. Can somebody turn that off, please? Oh. And this may be for City Attorney's Office. I'll let whoever wants to field this. What was the application for?
The application was for expansion of the Conservation District Number 2.
Okay. And in an expansion of an existing conservation district, can the expanded area include differing conditions than exist in the original conservation district? In other words, can the neighborhood committee include architectural characteristics, for example, or other terms in the expanded area that are different than what the original conservation district ordinance provides?
Good morning, Commissioners. Daniel Moore, City Attorney's Office. Yes, Commissioner Kingston. Subsection E of the Conservation District Ordinance expressly, subsection E is the section that deals with expanding an established CD. And littered throughout that subsection are references to additions to development and architectural standards. And in fact, when preparing the ordinance, the city shall prepare amendments to an established CD in accordance with another subsection to establish development and architectural standards to the area to be added. So yes, in subsection E allows the city to expand and to create its own architecture and development standards.
And what is the process to be followed to do that?
The process is outlined in subsection E, and I'll let Trevor explain that process, but the process is generally you have a neighborhood committee, or it can be an authorized hearing. If there's a neighborhood committee, you have to meet certain requirements in terms of who can be on the committee, but then you have petitions that are sent out, applications, et cetera, and Trevor can go into some of the more detailed into the weeds if you're interested in what they specifically did. But from the big picture, subsection E, it requires, like I said, generally a determination of eligibility, petitions, and then an application.
And does the neighborhood committee have to apply separately for some sort of amendment?
Subsection F deals with amending an established CD, but that's not how, they do not, to answer the question. And the reason is because while subsection F deals with amending the regulations within a CD, the subsection E allows you to amend the newly incorporated area to establish a new tract and new standards.
So let me restate this so I make sure I understand it. If you are applying to expand an existing CD, then any terms in that expansion section, which I believe is Subdistrict 4 in this case, those aren't an amendment. Those are new terms, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So you wouldn't apply for an amendment. It's an expansion with new terms.
Correct.
And so, similar question, if there were to be sub-districts within this new sub-districts, I guess, with differing conditions, again, you would not be applying under the section of the code that asks for, or that requires a separate application to amend an existing CD, because this is not an amendment to an existing CD. It is an expansion that would just have different conditions. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's correct. You can do all of that under the subsection E, which is the expanding the existing conservation district.
Okay, and is that the process that was followed in this case?
Yes, it was.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I have one more question for you. I see that there is a prohibition against solar panels on the front facade of homes. Do you believe that complies with the city's CCAP? I know the answer to that.
I would have to review the city CCAP in order to give you a definitive answer, Commissioner.
Okay, well, you have until the hearing. Thank you.
A little bit of homework. Commissioner Hampton, please.
Thank you. Similar question to Commissioner Kingston's has to do with the establishment of subdistricts. That's fairly common within both our historic and conservation districts. Is that correct, to have different sub-areas or sub-districts within those that reflect essentially their individual characteristics?
That's correct.
And then as this was evaluated, and I know there's the different architectural styles that are talked about here, all of those, well, I shouldn't say all of those, but those went through extensive review in your public meeting processes. Is that correct? And took community feedback?
That's correct. Each of those items that was listed on the petition were discussed in depth with a staff presentation of what, the existing zoning would require of them as it pertains to that particular item. And then following the discussion, there was a recap of what we heard from the neighbors. Oftentimes, we tried to kind of present some potential language for them to kind of see and consider what that might look like in an ordinance.
And I think in your presentation, you had covered that when you had your initial community meetings this spring, there was a lot of feedback. So a revised draft was posted, and then it was presented at your October meeting, again, taking in all that additional input that was received.
That's correct. The second draft reflected the input that was gathered following the first draft presentation.
Okay. And then just wanted to ask one general question. We received a letter that was raising a few questions, but one of which was talking about applying for tax incentives through the city program. Is it correct that you need to be within a designated historic district in order to qualify for those tax incentives?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Hampton. Yes, sir, Commissioner Chernoff.
I have a question. Somewhere in the case file, there was a timeline that broke down the meetings and what was discussed. At any of the meetings, was it ever discussed the effects of conservation districts on property values? And is that, well, I'll just let you go ahead and answer that.
So the question of how conservation districts might impact property values did come up at several meetings, specifically sort of the initial first post-application meeting once the petitions were distributed, but it certainly came up sort of in the casual conversations about certain things, and then certainly in these last couple of meetings.
Is there a data or a source that a city would use that's either local or nationally that substantiates opinions around that?
There was a study that included Dallas from I want to say the mid-90s, that has some pretty dated information. The city is currently undertaking a study, an economic impact study of historic and conservation districts that just is kicking off, this week, as a matter of fact.
Just as a side note, I would love to see the city dig into that more. I mean, that's always like a go-to talking point against conservation districts. It's like the number one thing that affects everybody. I really feel like more data around that to substantiate one way or the other would be really useful for communities.
Sure, and I think that was the initiative for the economic impact study that we're undertaking.
Vice Chair Rubin, followed by Commissioner Housewright.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Brown. I wanted to talk about the demolition provision. And the way that I read it is if you have a house that was built that's not contributing, it's not within one of the 5 styles, you can demolish it. Is that right? Without going through the lengthy process?
So the question was, if a property is non-contributing?
Not contributing, supporting.
There are no prohibitions on demolishing a building that's not designated as a contributing structure.
But then you've got to build back in one of the 5 architectural styles. So for example, if there's a 1955 ranch-style house that someone wants to tear down, they've got to build back in one of the 5 styles. Why is that in there? Why is that a requirement?
Well, so that was as a result of the neighborhood's desires. It's also based on the existing CD2. The contributing styles are almost exactly the same. Existing CD2, I believe, lumps Colonial Revival and Georgian together, whereas the neighbors in their discussion, they didn't really have anything that would be designated as Georgian. So neoclassical was added because there were several significant neoclassical.
And is that type of provision for a supporting non-contributing structure, is that common in other PDs throughout the city, or CDs throughout the city, or do others allow you to build, back a supporting structure in whatever architectural style you want?
Almost every conservation district that has architectural regulations requires you to build back in one of what they consider to be a contributing style, something that's consistent and compatible with the existing neighborhood.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Housewight.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Brown, the case report, there's 5 bullet points about the purpose of a conservation district. I assume that you believe that this conservation district, the proposed ordinance, satisfies those 5 points. But could you particularly focus on the last 3 about economic revitalization, livability, and harmonious, efficient growth? How does this promote those 3?
Well, I think part of that can be addressed in what we are seeing in other parts of the city where incompatible new development may come in, sort of changing the overall character of a neighborhood, potentially impacting how those properties might be developed in the future. Specific to livability, I think when we talk about the importance of, and that's part of the reason I showed the slide with the adjacent conservation districts and historic districts is, this area is significant, not only obviously to those who live there, but I think to Dallas and its sort of heritage in large. So I think that sort of addresses the compatibility with what, especially the Forward Dallas plan is wanting to do in protecting our neighborhoods. I don't know if there's any of those specifically that you want me to address directly.
Well, I'm not going to make my comments on those, but I think those 3 are not necessarily accomplished through this. But final question. In the 80s and 90s, I lived in this neighborhood. I lived on Meadow Lake. The northern proposed boundary would have been in my alley. I know those streets well. I've driven them twice in the last week. One of the charms of Lakewood in the 80s and today is the high amount of eclecticism, if that's a word. It's very eclectic. And so how does this ordinance, which sort of puts everything into 5 boxes, how does it honor the eclectic nature of that neighborhood?
Well, it shouldn't change it immediately, right? Because the only time we will be making any type of new construction would be if any of these buildings are demolished. So it shouldn't change the eclecticism of the neighborhood, certainly in the near term. The discussion about the 5 styles was a result of the neighborhood's conversations about, I think, wanting to be compatible with the existing CD2, but also that those were the styles that if new construction was to come into the neighborhood, that they desired to see something that was more in keeping with those, original homes to the district.
Commissioner Carpenter.
I did notice in the long list that broke down, all of the homes that are in this area and identified the style and where they were located, that there seemed to be some blocks in the, 100 blocks in the expansion area where all of the homes on that block were designated supporting. Is it possible that there are significant homes on those blocks that aren't supporting? Because you can be significant if you were if it was designed by a particular architect, but you might not necessarily be in one of those 5 styles. I guess I'm trying to understand why those particular blocks were included if everything was designated as supporting.
So the boundaries of the proposed expansion area were determined by the neighborhood committee. That was part of the determination of eligibility that was submitted. I think people focusing on the number of supporting structures in an area, that was not a factor in the initial evaluation of the determination of eligibility, because it hadn't been discussed what was going to be one of the contributing styles or what might be a non-contributing or supporting. So I think it was merely the neighborhood looking at the area and identifying what they felt like would offer a buffer or protection of the existing character of those homes, especially there on Lakewood and Lakeshore and Tokelon. But there are certainly supporting structures that are identified as significant. I know a handful down on the far end of Lakewood or Lakeshore that were listed as supporting, but also as significant structures because of who they're associated with.
One other question. I believe in the staff in the case report, it says that when the petitions were done, it was 68% support. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. But we've been getting emails giving us some polling numbers, survey numbers that, seem to say different things. Do you know anything about the mechanism of this survey or polling that was done, I must assume, by a neighbor?
I can't speak to the method of polling that was done. We do have a map based on the responses that went out with the CPC notification that includes 102 in favor within the boundaries of the proposed expansion and 108 in opposition.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Hall, followed by Commissioner Kingston.
When a supporting home is demolished and has to be rebuilt in one of 5 styles, does that just mean the exterior of this home has to look a certain way? It doesn't impact what you would do on the interior, does it?
That's correct. The Conservation District would have no oversight over interiors, and really the architectural regulations will only apply to the area that's what's referred to as the wraparound. So the front half of the house has the architectural regulations. So that's really the area that would be focused on in terms of one of the 5 styles meeting the criteria.
So it could be quite modern on the inside, but look more historical on the outside. Does that require, to do something like that, does that require specialty architects and specialty construction companies?
So the city has 18 conservation districts that all only regulate the exterior. As far as I know, there has not been any issue in finding professionals to accomplish producing plans based on the regulations.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Kingston.
In creating the petitions that go out to the neighborhood, you include a list of potential development and architectural standards that the CD may regulate, correct?
That's correct.
And does the city have a form petition that has a list of potential items?
So the development code, the enabling ordinance for conservation districts outlines those areas that must be included, and then also gives the ability to add additional if the neighborhood sees fit. There is no form petition that is used. In fact, the neighbors can decide, you have to specify the types of things that you're going to talk about under each of those potential items that the ordinance allows you to talk about. So specifically, as it relates to fences, it says you have to regulate fences, but then the neighbors can decide what is it about fences that they really want to discuss possibly regulating.
So the code identifies certain topics that can be up for regulation, and those topics have to be listed on the petition as items that are up for discussion.
That's correct. We only discuss items on the petition.
And then during the neighborhood meetings, what regulations actually come out of, actually make it into the ordinance is a product of the community's discussions.
That's
In other
correct.
words, you have a broad topic on the petition and the specificity gets hashed out in the neighborhood meetings?
Correct.
Is there any prohibition in the code for listing all of the potential topics that the code allows in your petition?
Not that I know of.
And in this case, were all of the potential topics listed in the petition?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, commissioners? Our two commissioners online, I can't see you anymore, so if there's any questions online, we'll take those now. Okay. Thank you very much, sir. We'll see you this afternoon. Commissioners, let's go ahead and stay in order. We do have some moving pieces as always, so let's go ahead and go to case number 21 before we head into the zoning cases. And then just FYI, this item may be moved up on the agenda this afternoon if we have to. 21. Good morning. The microphone.
Oh, thank you, Commissioner. The next case is case number Z189-240, Jimtown Neighborhood Authorized Hearing. And this is an authorized hearing that was approved in 2019, and the purpose was to determine proper zoning for an area of Jimtown neighborhood that is predominantly developed with single-family residential structures, but is zoned multifamily MF2A. A lot of the discussion and public engagement about the rezoning happened during walk-up, so we approached this from an implementation standpoint of the neighborhood, of the area plan, West Oak Cliff area plan. The area is entirely zoned MF2, and it is about 10 acres. So that is the general location map. It is in West Oak Cliff in District 1. That is the map of the area of request. I know we don't have a lot of time, So I'm going to rush through the slide. If you want me to address anything on the slide, just let me know. But in general, the area is approximately 10.37 acres. It's predominantly occupied by single-family residential units that were built in the 1920s. Only 2 of the 50 properties in the area of request have multi-family properties. So just to give you a little bit background about the case, like I said, we approached this from an implementation of the West Oak Cliff Area Plan, which was unanimously adopted by the CPC in 2022. And that plan do provide the long-range land use and redevelopment vision for the area. So when staff was coming up with the recommendation, they followed the recommendation of the plan, which recommended that we downzone the district to match what was already on the ground. That plan also did identify several areas, and this is one of them. So we have other authorized hearing in West Oak Cliff that we are working on as part of the implementation of the West Oak Cliff Area Plan. This flowchart kind of summarizes the engagement, public engagement process that we went through. We've had about 4 meetings with the community, and they've been pretty supportive of the recommendation of staff. They wanted to protect the single-family residential neighborhood that they have. So our recommendation is an alignment with the community vision for this area. Again, this is just a summary of the same flow chart. It shows the dates when we had the meeting, what the main topic was, and what the outcome was. So it summarizes that we've had 4 meetings. The first one was on March 15, and in that we did explain the process to the community, introduce them to the authorized hearing process. And in the next meeting, we did again explain the process and introduce them to the zoning concept that we are going to introduce. And the third meeting was hosted by the neighborhood association themselves. They invited us, and they had discussion, and they had a vision that they wanted us to implement. So there was already support from the community that aligned with the staff recommendation. And then the last meeting that we had, the 4th meeting, was just to build consensus and ensure that we were on the same page. And then after that, we went to ZRT, and here we are today presenting it to the CPC. As you can see, these are the photos taken of the properties in the area of request. It's a pretty standard established single-family residential neighborhood. There were some recommendations in the plan to consider urban design standards about sidewalks and other elements from a form-based code. But based on what we saw and our assessment on the ground, I think what just needed to be addressed was the zoning. The neighborhood is pretty established and is a stable neighborhood. Again, in terms of existing land use, the area of request is predominantly surrounded by single-family residential structures, Zone R 7.5A, except to the east where we have some commercial and mixed uses, primarily retail and personal services. This table summarizes the surrounding uses, and as you can see, it's again, the area is surrounded by single-family residences, except on the eastern side where we have some commercial uses. Again, that is represented in a map. You can see what each and every parcel that borders or abuts the area of request and what the use in them is. So the current zoning on the area of request is MF2A. It is the same zoning for the entire district, and it's surrounded by R7.5A and MU and CR to the east. So in terms of staff recommendation, we approached this from trying to match what was already on the ground. And the district has 50 properties. 48 of them have single-family detached housing. And so the recommendation was that for any property that had single-family detached structure. We recommended R7.5 single-family residential district. And there are 2 properties within the area of request that are highlighted there in red. Those 2 properties have multifamily apartments with 4 units each, so they're quadplexes. Initially, when we had the meeting with the community, they wanted the entire area to be zoned single-family, but we explained to them, the recommendation of WOCAP and also the priorities of the city from Fort Dallas standpoint of preserving naturally occurring affordable housing, and they were amenable to that. The community has been very supporting and very understanding, so they were open to downzoning a bit of those properties from MF2 to MF1A. The other thing that the community did request staff to do is to consider establishing accessory dwelling unit overlay on the single-family portion of the district, on the area that we are recommending for single-family residences. We did check with the city attorney's office, and they confirmed that we could do that. So staff is recommending establishing accessory dwelling unit overlay over the area that has single-family residences only. The 2 properties that are still going to continue being multifamily are not included in that overlay. These are a summary of the development standard, pretty standard-based zoning development standard. And then you are familiar with the accessory dwelling unit. So currently there are 2 established processes that a property owner can use to build an accessory dwelling unit. One is to apply to the Board of Adjustment and ask for exemption. And the other one is to go through a neighborhood petition process where they establish an ADU overlay. That's what we call a by right process. And then the ADU would be allowed in that district by right. And then this is the third one. What staff is recommending is to create an ADU overlay through the authorized hearing. The only thing that it does is that it removes a requirement to go to the Board of Adjustment for approval or for the neighborhood to do the petition process. But still all the other requirements of ADU or the regulation of ADU as a contained in the city code still do apply. So the map over there shows the ADU overlay boundary, and as you can see, 2 of the properties that have multifamily apartments are exempt. They are outside the ADU overlay. But then the property owners would still have to apply for a permit to build an ADU, and all the regulations that are stipulated in the code would still apply. I'm not going to go through them, but they're listed over there. And then we also did address the issue of height limitation. The community was concerned about that, and they wanted to ensure that there's protection for the existing single family. So we did recommend 3:1 RPS consistent with what was surrounding the district. In terms of staff recommendation, staff is recommending approval. And that's it. Any question?
Thank you, sir. Questions? Commissioner Chernock, please, sir.
It's my understanding that the neighborhood has some existing ADUs that are operating illegally effectively. Is that true?
Yes. So during the discussion, the issue came up, and there were mentioned that there are already some structures that are operating as ADU. So we did, one of the things that we did during one of the community meetings that the neighborhood association organized is we walked every street, looked at every property in the area with the community residents, and we did identify some structures that already have accessory structures. Now, we are not trained to determine whether they are legal or not, but my count was roughly 15 to 20 structures that we saw. And then this is also a neighborhood that was built in the 1920s, so there have been additions. So if there are some structures of ADU that are attached to the main unit, it's very hard to tell. So, but there are a few of them.
And so if this should pass, those would become legal?
The only thing that we are addressing through the ADU overlay is to allow them to exist there if they choose to, but they still have to meet all the code requirements for ADU.
Of course. Yeah. And the other question, my understanding is that the dialogue with this neighborhood and the city predated WOCAP. the intent for this to happen was something that has been a long time in the making.
Yes, the conversation had happened for a long time. I think most of it happened during walk-up. And when we walked into the community, I think they already had a vision of what they wanted. The zoning also seemed to be out of place because it didn't match what was on the ground. And the neighborhood association was very supportive of the down zoning as proposed in the walk-up. So the conversation had happened amongst them, the property owners and the community, for a long time.
Thank you, sir. Questions? Commissioner Hampton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. I see a lot of similarities, some of our other cases on the docket today. But so the MF2 zoning was overlaid on an existing single-family residence, and that's really what this is doing, is bringing it back to align with the uses that are on the ground today. And where there was an exception, staff has recognized that and is acknowledging that through the alternate zoning district. Is that, am I just in a nutshell?
Correct, that's correct, ma'am. There are two residential structures that have apartment complex, the quadplex, were built in 1987.
Right.
And I suspect that is when they rezoned that area. Probably somebody thought they were going to build apartments there. That never happened. The structures are still single family. And so what you've said is exactly correct. That's what is happening.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Carpenter.
So a newly constructed ADU could not be taller than the primary unit, correct?
Yes, that's one of the...
The only way it could be taller than the primary unit would be if it's on top of an existing detached garage, and then it's limited by the 30 feet that's in the R75 zoning district?
That's correct.
Okay. I think I read somewhere that, some of these lots are not actually, existing lots with structures on them are not actually 7,500 square feet, which R75 would require. But because they have had homes on them in the past or were legal building sites, if it were to be redeveloped, there would be no problem with the fact that the lot is smaller than 7,500 square feet. Is that correct?
You're correct, yes. We didn't do the measurement, but looking at the data, we've given the range, 6,000 to 7,500 square feet. Now, that is based off DCAD, which is an approximation, but they seem pretty standard with what is around them, and they all have R7.5A zoning.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any other questions on this item? Any questions from our folks online? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Commissioners, I think we have time to squeeze in a zoning case or two. Our development plan, do we need that brief? Would anyone request to have that brief? This is item number 2. Okay, well then let's go ahead and jump right into case number 3.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Case number 3 is going to be held. We're working out with a few clarifications.
Perfect.
So we can brief it when we hear it. It'll
Thank
be
you
on
so
December
much.
the 5th.
December 5th. So let's go to case number 4. Commissioner Hampton, is that one okay? 4? All right, let's go to 4. Mr. Bate, good morning, sir.
Good morning. This is case number Z234-241, an application for a new planned development district for WR3 walkable urban residential uses on property zoned in IR Industrial Research District located on the southeast line of Kimsey Drive north of Morningstar Place, approximately 7,405 square feet in size. Located here in kind of near the Love Field area, the Stemmons Corridor Medical District area. This is the aerial map showing the subject site. The zoning map, so this is a bit of an interesting area. There's a mix of MF2 and WR3 zoning in this area. There's also the IR Industrial Research District and then PD 907 that contains attached single-family houses. Some of the history around this area is that this parcel is zoned IR, and then everything to the northeast of it was also zoned IR for the last several decades, I would think. And over the years, it has been rezoned piece by piece to WR3. So currently zoned IR, and the applicant is proposing a 5-unit multifamily building under the WR3 walkable urban residential standards. However, in order to accomplish this, the applicant's requesting a PD with the WR3 uses. We'll get into that in a bit. Here we are on Kimsey Drive, looking southeast at the subject site, then looking northeast, and then to the north. To the northwest, we're seeing this general trend of multifamily housing throughout the area, as well as that attached single family further to the southwest. Looking south of the subject site again, and you can see in the background of the photo there's an existing multifamily built under MF2. The development standards, so this is always a little fun to get into here in the weeds of the form-based districts. I'll try to keep it high level, and if there are questions, certainly we can help clarify here. But the main thrust of WR3 and form-based districts in general is that they are focused less on just regulating uses, as our basic Euclidean zoning is, and more focused on the built environment itself. They want to look at how does something fit into, in this case, a walkable urban residential area. So for instance, your front setbacks, and this is based on your townhouse development type. So let me back that up there. Under form-based districts, you've got your general district. In this case, it's WR3. Within each of these districts, there's certain building types that are allowed. There's also actual uses that are allowed. And each development type is going to have different standards than other ones. So in this case, we're using the townhouse development type as an example. The front setback is going to be between 5 feet and 15 feet. It's a 5-foot minimum. You are required to have a certain amount of street frontage. So the idea here is that rather than having a lot where you have a very narrow building that doesn't really have much street frontage, doesn't engage it, you're required to have at least 70% of that frontage on the street. The parking setback on the primary street has to be 30 feet minimum, so away from the front yard line. And if it's adjacent to multifamily or non-residential, it has to have a 5-foot minimum setback there. Your side setback is 0 feet or 5 feet. It just depends on whether it's adjacent to multifamily or non-residential. The rear setback is a 24-foot minimum. The density is 1,200 square feet per unit. And then the height, rather than having a straight height limit, it's 1-story minimum, 3.5 stories or 50 feet max. You have a story height regulation. And probably the most important thing is actually your transparency requirement. So 30% transparency on the ground story, 20% on the upper story. Again, the idea here is that when you're building out these walkable urban residential areas, one of the things that makes this area walkable and feel nice is to have transparency, to have windows, to have doors, rather than walking along a long concrete, brick, what have you facade. You get some activation by having that transparency requirement. There's also a requirement for entrances to be on the front, on the primary street rather than on the side. Again, that's talking about your engagement with the street. Blank wall area, 30 feet max. And the special standards here I marked there's proximity slope. So why are they asking for a PD? It's pretty simple. The way that our code is written, RPS, which is generated by our residential districts, which includes MF2, RPS applies to your typical things that you would hope it would apply to, such as commercial uses, retail uses, et cetera. But it also applies to our form-based districts. If they were to go with a straight WR3 form-based district, they would actually be limited in height to about 26 feet, give or take. Technically, the way that it projects, you could theoretically have a building that begins at 26 feet and would go up to about 29 feet, but it wouldn't really be practical. Meanwhile, if they went with an MF2 district, which is what was actually originally requested, they would be able to build up to 36 feet in height. So kind of let that sink in. If it went with just straight WR3, it would be limited to a lower height than what would be allowed with an MF2. As such, what we looked at here was, well, one, is WR3 appropriate for the area? And if so, would a PD make sense to address this issue of the RPS? So the PD would allow for an exemption from RPS and thereby achieve the benefits of the WR3 standards, which is something that has been pursued along Kimsey Drive in the past. The height, the only proposed conditions are that the height is the property is not subject to RPS, and for plans, no conceptual plan or development plan being required. This gives some flexibility to the developer to just go ahead and follow the WR3 standards and build whatever they see fit. Staff's recommendation is approval subject to conditions.
Thank you, sir. Commissioner Hampton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Bate. Is it correct that if this site was considered as MF2 as originally suggested, it would impose the same height limitation on the adjacent WR3 property.
It would do that, yes.
So this is a way of bridging earlier rezoning with the trend that is now being established along Kimsey, which is, and I guess I'll back up one step and say, is it correct that there's existing single family even though it is zoned IR?
Yes, the existing single family was built there. My best guess would be that this was an area that was established before any of our, either our contemporary zoning regime or what was existing before the 1980s amendment.
Right.
Very common throughout the city.
And so really, and I think you noted this, everything is evolving into multifamily style development, whether it's through a PD, whether it's through a mixed use district, or the WR3 that's being utilized on the south side of Kimsey. So this is really essentially bridging where the two are intersecting, and that's the reason why it's a PD.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions on this item, commissioners? Okay. Commissioners, it's exactly noon. Let's go ahead and take our lunch break. We'll brief the rest of the zoning cases before we hear them. It's 12 o'clock. That concludes the briefing of the Dallas City Plan Commission. We'll be back online at 12:30. Commissioner Wheeler's not online, so we'll come back to this one at the end. So let's go to number 6.